Hello everyone. So, I'm going to talk today about some different competitive formats. And I should put big, bright red letters, kind of warning text, that I don't really play anything except sixes. So, my opinion regarding other formats is inherently less informed than those who do play those formats. And if I say any obvious misinformation, then yeah, please, Highlander players, prolander players, whatever, feel free to correct me. And I would very much appreciate that. That being said, I am not here to talk about what is my favorite format, which is sixes, and I'm not here to talk about what is kind of the de facto format, which again is sixes. All in-person tournaments and whatnot, and just kind of the primary form of competitive in this game is just sixes, and like it or hate it, that's just kind of the way things are. But I kind of wanted to talk about other formats, what they do differently, what decisions they make, because as we understand, when you want to win without any necessary, this is not the phrasing I'm looking for. When you're just trying to win, usually, these combat classes like soldier, demo, medic, scout tend to be very good, of course. And to be clear, like in Six's history, there were absolutely like full-time heavies and whatnot experimented. You would see full-time engineer on gravel pit, or rather, engineer on defense on gravel pit. You would see all these classes in different game modes and maps tested and played with seriously with players trying to win, because obviously they didn't really understand, well, not understand, they didn't have a frame of reference for how the meta would end up being. They just tried to play with what was effective and what gave them good value and what won, and then they kind of figured out that, yeah, these classes are just very consistently good in many different situations. But that does admittedly suck for some players that might not be interested in that. And again, I totally understand, and that two scouts, two soldiers, demo, medic might not be interesting for people. You might not want to play it, even though it is the best option for playing this. So some other formats do take that into consideration and introduce restrictions and whatnot in order to kind of enforce off-class stuff, enforce, more play from other classes, which I'm not trying to be like the sixes elitist or whatever here, genuinely, but I am particular about my phrasing here that it is enforcing that, right? Because if you're making decisions about, basically like the only time you're gonna be having a full-time pyro or engineer or heavy or whatnot, spy as well for that matter, the only time you're going to be having those classes full time is if your format in some way or another kind of mandates that, right? Unless you are giving particular care to those classes to see them more often than just the situations that they're most effective in. And we do see this in the case of Highlander, of course, just requiring one of every class. So of course you're going to have one of every class, and Prolander, which doesn't require one of every class, but limits every class to one, such that you can only have one scout, one soldier, one demo, one medic, which basically every team does, as far as I'm aware. And then the other three classes are kind of your off-class of choosing. So of course these formats do, in some sense, mandate these classes be played. And of course you can make the argument about literal game mode as well. Playing attack, defend, or payload or whatnot, which that is certainly like a legitimate argument, I think, that, if you actually had people play payload and play attack, defend, or whatnot, then you would be seeing more engineer or more heavy and whatnot. I think that's true, absolutely. But I do also keep in mind that in like the actual infancy of sixes, like yes, these formats were played. People just kind of preferred 5CP because it gives generally more dynamic kind of decision making and risk reward, and you get to play both attack and defense kind of at the same time, rather than just one or the other in concrete units. And so people tended to prefer that, I guess. Although I concede how, in some sense, the sticking to 5 CP does kind of artificially neuter certain classes like engineer, for instance. But on the flip side, including those formats would artificially boost engineer at the same time, I think. But anyway, this is enough just random rambling, I think. Let's actually introduce the formats, of course. So I have already kind of alluded to it, but the other primary formats that people play is, number one is Highlander, which is definitely the oldest of them. Probably as old as Sixes, if I had to guess. Maybe a little newer, but like not by much at all. Highlander is absolutely ancient as well. And it's an extremely simple prospect, right? You just have one of every class. And you tend to play bigger maps, such as, payload maps. And I think it's primarily just payload and Koth that they play. Or not primarily, exclusively payload and Koth that they play. Although I have seen, like, really long ago, Highlander did play some 5CP, which to me sounds crazy, actually. But yeah, of course, way more people in the server. I do think, oddly enough, that despite the fact that a lot of people do criticize Sixes towards the class selection, in Highlander, despite the fact that you can play every class, these classes still have meta roles that not everyone is necessarily going to like either. Like, if you are, for instance, a Pyro main, and, you love using the Extinguisher, Degreaser, Flare Gun combo or whatever, and you just like going for clips and combos in casual settings or whatnot, Highlander Pyro is an extremely different experience, and you are kind of relegated to just being an air blast dispenser around your medic, I guess, with the occasional spy checker. Yeah, there are definitely some roles in Highlander that are, I'll say, less desirable or less impactful as well. Like engineer as well is kind of a notorious, not AFK class, but just like you don't really have to do anything that much. Now, of course, your buildings are still useful. You're still building and maintaining them and whatnot, but you were just considered a less useful class. Like, it's going to be okay when your engineer dies, at least much better than if your sniper or demo dies. And again, the powerful classes like demo and medic are still very important in Highlander, still critically important. Only in Highlander, sniper is also a very, very centralizing force, because both teams are going to have a sniper all the time. And sniper is also just a broken class as well in basically every format and just the game in general. So it's going to be a very centralizing force in that format. But that being said, I mean, people still play and enjoy Highlander. Not my cup of tea, but it doesn't have to be my cup of tea for me to at least respect it, even if I might not enjoy it. And I suppose I may as well just give some context on like some of the reasons I'm not a huge fan. Primarily just not that it feels random. That's not what I'm looking for here. It's just that it feels that your personal impact is going to be less relevant, especially if you are on one of the less important classes. Like if you're playing payload offense on Scout and you are just the cart, then yeah, your contribution to the game is not going to feel as important as, a demos would. But also, like, if you get 2 kills, then that's just less relevant to the game state than it would be in 6 versus 6, just inherently, right? Because you are killing a smaller proportion of their team than you would be with fewer players, of course. I mean, that's just obvious on the face of it, but also it just makes basically the fewer players that there are in the server, the more your individual impact matters, which I think is a very attractive part of Sixes. When you get a kill or get multiple kills, you know that 2 picks you can push off of, and if you get 2 kills with like a trap, for instance, as a demo, that feels really good because now you know that your team gets to push off of that decision. Now, of course, it's not to say that there's no personal reward in Highlander, which I disagree with completely. And again, extremely limited experience, so Highlander players, feel free to call me terrible and clueless. I would appreciate that. Yeah, that's definitely an element to things. But Highlander is attractive for a lot of people because you see the full array of classes being played. Now, of course, to reiterate, these classes aren't played in the same ways that they are played in a casual setting a lot of the time. And of course, some roles are just inherently less useful or impactful as others, which is somewhat the case in sixes as well. Of course, like medic and demo are, of course, the most important, and then scouts and soldiers are less so. But of course, every role in sixes does have its own niche and its own impact, and your team will really feel the negative impact of a team or any of the players not playing their role correctly. So yeah, that's kind of the intro for Highlander. What's unique about it is that you can play, well, every single class sees use, and so it is probably more accessible for more casual players as well, just because not only are the team sizes much more comparable to a casual setting, but also the class compositions are definitely going to be more comparable, where you have just a little bit of everything, right? So next is going to be Prolander, and Prolander is kind of it is a somewhat new format and well, all the formats are kind of invented, but Prolander is actually interesting because the initial creator of RGL, Sigafu, from my understanding, did create Prolander, and Prolander is funny. It is dismissive sixes elitism of me, but it is a funny thing to point out that Sigafu, of course, being an engineer main, is kind of creating this format that is an attempt to be like sixes, but with off-classing. So it's basically like you can make the observation or accusation that Sigafu is like trying to make sixes that he can just play engineer in, which of course is silly and a joke, but funny nonetheless. But what is Prolander? Well, it is 7v7. Oh, I need to stop taunting in these demos because, oh, and it's gone. Perfect. So Prolander is 7v7, so smaller team size than Highlander. There are no required classes, of course, but there is a class limit of 1 across the board. Now, again, I have played Prolander, unlike Highlander, but I haven't enjoyed it particularly much, and that's strictly a matter of my opinion, because I do actually respect Prolander, and I think that it handles some things elegantly. I mean, just class limit 1 across the board with team size of 7. 7 is not so many people that your kills seem to matter less. But it is also enough that with class limit 1 in conjunction with it, you're going to see plenty of off classes being played pretty much all the time. So that can be pretty interesting, right? Now, of course, you're still going to want Scout, Soldier, Demo, Medic, as you always will in every single format, because those are just such generally useful classes. But you get to see a wider diversity of options. And actually, in a discussion about Prolander with a friend of mine who is a much bigger fan of it than myself, made an interesting point that a lot of the what's the word I'm looking for? Less desirable, I suppose. A lot of the less desirable roles in Highlander don't really have that same effect in Prolander. So, for example, like playing Pyro in Prolander, you're not really going to be so much delegated to just being the medic babysitter, and you might be able to kind of loosen up a little bit. Same with something like Engineer or what have you. So, in some ways, Prolander is kind of a happy medium because not only do you get these diversity of classes if that's what you're interested in, if you want a format that, again, getting on my sixes elitist soapbox here, you do kind of have to mandate these classes to be played full-time for them to be played full-time because, again, they are generally weaker in those situations than a scout or a soldier or other classes. But you do get to see these diversity of classes being played. Now, one interesting thing as far as meta is concerned is something that I really enjoy about sixes, of course, is that, you know, all your decision making matters a lot. you know, individual decisions matter a lot. But also, like, if you actually listen and pay attention to pretty much any time I go in depth about a very specific Sixes topic, like when I talk in depth about what a last hold looks like, what you're looking for in it, you know, what the different objectives of the different classes are for all these different things, you start to see just the amount of depth of counterplay and decision making and just layers and layers of I don't want to just use the word depth again, but just imagine I'm using some synonym for depth. Basically, there is just so much to take in that I really, really like. And this isn't with consideration to necessarily class selection or anything else. That being said, in a format like Prolander, the game does become less about these deep personal decisions, and it does become more about kind of a pick-counter-pick style of gameplay, right? Where maybe you might want to have someone switch to spy to take out a heavy that's, you know, a problem. Just to give a basic example, right? So more of the metagame is about class selection in order to counter other classes rather than having a distinct lineup that is just generally good at approaching every situation, which maybe if Prolander was more popular, because definitely the most popular two are Sixes than Highlander, and Prolander is not as common. There's not a full-time Prolander league or season like there is for Sixes and Highlander. It's more so relegated to the occasional cup here and there and tournament and whatnot. But maybe if Prolander were played a lot more, then you would get to that level of refinement where a certain class lineup is kind of figured out to be just the most versatile and best at approaching most situations. And it wouldn't surprise me if it reached that kind of level. But you definitely introduce a lot more elements of counter-picking rather than counter-playing, which I am personally not a fan of, but I absolutely see the merit in. And there are people that definitely enjoy games that center more around that style of gameplay. And that style of gameplay is also more reminiscent of casual TF2 as well, because, you know, it's, you know, in a casual setting, people are switching classes around and trying to switch classes to approach different situations. So, yeah, I can absolutely see the merit in Prolander, and I think it is generally... I definitely would prefer playing Prolander to Highlander. That being said, there's one pretty glaring weakness with both that I'm just a big, not so much fan on, I'll say. And that is the fact that when it comes to requiring off classes, requiring full-time off classes, pretty much the first one on the list, no matter what, is Sniper. That is what you're going to want first in Prolander, and that is, of course, one of the most centralizing classes in Highlander as well. And playing against a full-time Sniper is just so unfun for me personally. I don't like the class that your counterplay is to not engage or have your teammates deal with it, depending on what class you're playing. I could complain about Sniper all day, and I might make a video about what Sniper does in Sixes. I have a video of how to counter Sniper in Sixes, which, spoiler, it's let your soldiers deal with it. And of course, you have different decision-making processes about Ubers and whatnot. It is, of course, like with everything in Sixes, a lot deeper than it seems on the surface. But yeah, a lot of the time, Sniper is just not that engaging a class to play against for me personally. So yeah, these formats that tend to have a full-time Sniper, I am just inherently less interested in. It makes it less fun for me personally, and yeah, I see that as a big downside of these formats. But yeah, I figured I may as well just give a little introduction and explanation for these alternative formats, because again, people really do, and I'm tired of reiterating these points so many times, but you know, it's not uncommon for me, especially recently when I actually talk about these topics, to see people talk about, you know, stale meta, which... And now I'm realizing actually that what seems like contradictory positions for me are actually just because it's different people saying things that have slightly different opinions that might have the same like core backbone of one opinion, but like slightly different in one way or the other, and you take it all at the same time as if it's the same person, but obviously it's not. But yeah, when it comes to accusations of like quote-unquote stale meta, I think a lot of what people are referring to is simply just class selection. And these are formats that have tried to address that and have a wider diversity of classes by mandating them, right, in some form or another, by either restricting the amount of these core combat 6s classes that you can see in order to guarantee that some off classes are going to be seen all the time, or by just requiring one of every class. In some form or another, they are mandating these classes to be played, and as a result, you get to see them outside of their niches. So that could absolutely be something that's interesting to people, absolutely something that could be enjoyable to people. And yeah, I figured I'd point out some examples of what that kind of competitive format might look like, because again, I'm just going to hop on my competitive my 6's soapbox for one last time before signing off here. Again, to reiterate, like, it's not that these classes are being restricted out of play by 6's. It's just that these over the 15 plus years that this format has been played, without particular consideration to what classes get played, it was very soon figured out that, yeah, these are just generally useful classes for the widest variety of game states. And, in a competitive format where you're just trying to win without consideration for what classes you use, you're just going to use what's best, and these are what's best. And all the other ones are, of course, still used all the time, but just in the situations that they're useful rather than all the time, which I think makes a lot of sense given the design of TF2. But okay, off my soapbox now. But yeah, if you're interested in these formats, absolutely, you can check them out. I'm sure they have a lot to offer for different people, because again, I mean, TF2 is just such a well-designed and diverse game that you can enjoy it in all sorts of different formats, which again, just kind of reiterating points from past videos, but whatever you enjoy and have fun with is worthwhile. And here are just a couple examples of alternative formats that mandate this a little bit more off-classing and a little bit more class diversity. So anyway, hope you guys enjoy, and I will see you guys next time.